Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. Today, we're going to talk about an article called AEW Gets Modern Masculinity. It is written in Last Word on Sports by a gentleman by the name of James Stainings. This made me laugh. I'm not going to hold you up. This is for your listening pleasure. Of course, the general idea of this is that our good feminist friend here thinks that toxic masculinity is bad for men, and AEW shows positive masculinity. And we should all strive to pay more attention to the positive masculinity of AEW. So we're going to go through this thing. Going to have some fun with this. So sit back, relax, and let's get into it. I'm not going to read the entire thing. I'm going to let you know when I'm skipping through it. But I don't want to lose any of the context. Because I don't want to take the guy out of context and we laughing at him and you don't understand why. So, and I've read this thing already. He makes some decent points. It's not 100% bad. But it's bad enough. All right, so here he goes. Sports generally are masculine affairs. Traditionally, sport is the male domain, filled with testosterone and emotions that are somewhat more acceptable to show compared to other arenas in life. Ingrained in pro wrestling's history is machismo, tough men and big men and strong men. Men who fight and won't give up unless pushed to their breaking point. They won't cry, and at its core is hyper-masculinity. There are plenty of old wrestlers and fans who like it this way. It's traditional, it's safe, it's how things have always been, especially given how the world is changing in a way many folks are uncomfortable with. They want things to remain as they are. AEW on multiple occasions with various male wrestlers and storylines challenges traditional masculinity. They offer a more modern, diverse, and for some fans, challenging look at traditional masculine values. And at times they take criticism for this, as I'll address later. Now we're going to skip over to the WWE part because it's not really relevant, at least not right now. We'll come back to it. He creates this false dichotomy between WWE and AEW. We'll talk about that when we get there. So the first thing that made me howl at this is that he wrote, "I'm British," and I almost died. He wrote, "I'm British." And boy, I knew it. What is wrong with the Brit Bongs? British wrestling fans. What's wrong with you? How do we end up with these guys? Why are all of them therapists and male feminists? How did this happen? So we're gonna try to put out of our minds that this young man is British. Let's just go try to get that one out of our heads. So he's talking about the toxic masculinity, and he did write an article about the toxic masculinity of the bloodline. I actually read that after this. We're going to do this one first. We'll do the toxic masculinity of the bloodline some other time. He starts talking about the stiff upper lip mentality, which is something that he quotes from Vice, which is the toxic masculinity about men not going to the hospital and not wanting to admit weakness, these kinds of things. So he gives us some background on himself because male feminists they turn everything into a therapy session. And he basically talks about, being bullied in school because of course he was. And he says, quote, "As a teenager, I got into wrestling during the Ruthless Aggression era, primarily SmackDown. I learned from my heroes Kurt Angle, Chris Benoit, and Eddie Guerrero more about being a man. In hindsight, this seems problematic, given the reality that all self-medicated to one degree or another to deal with their pain. 2 died young. My favorite of the trio committed murder. All of the above contributed to my issues with anxiety, imposter syndrome, and other mental health issues. Eventually, I sought support. I talked to family and friends more openly and have received counseling when needed. I learned communication was a strength and not a weakness. How toxic masculinity has affected my life and others. Toxic masculinity is still a big part of wrestling. I wrote last month about how WWE's most successful storyline in years, the Bloodline, is all about toxic masculinity. So let's go through this. So this guy, who apparently has no father, and he's learning about being a man from watching Eddie Guerrero vignettes during the Ruthless Aggression era. My God, no wonder this kid is so screwed up. I mean, for starters, did this guy not hear Kurt Angle won a gold medal with a broken neck? All right. Did he not understand what it meant to have a goal and to want to achieve that goal so badly that even if your body is falling apart, you push forward? You know, he's going to talk a little bit later about things like perseverance, which is what you're talking about here when these guys are using drugs. Most of them were in tremendous amounts of physical pain. I mean, of these three guys, just the three guys he's talking about, two of them had broken necks. Benoit broke his neck, Angle broke his neck. All three of them end up being addicts. Well, two of the three, Guerrero and Kurt Angle, end up being, Eddie Guerrero was not only addicted to pills, he was also addicted to alcohol. When you're talking about, and I think all three did steroids, that's pretty obvious. Okay, we've got this young guy who is trying to model himself after his heroes that he sees on SmackDown. Guys who get hit in head with steel chairs a couple of times a month. That's going to absolutely destroy brain cells and all this sorts of stuff. But this is what he's seeing because apparently he has no father, no older brothers, no cousins, no uncle, nothing, no male role models. He doesn't play on any teams. He apparently just has no grip on reality because he's learning about masculinity and about being a man from watching pro wrestling on television. I think we found the heart of the problem. But no, it's not over. We got to get started. He starts talking about Hangman Page, and he literally wrote this passage here. Many have called Hangman Adam Page the main character of AEW. Who has done that? Anyway, his arc to becoming the AEW World Champion brought back to wrestling not only the long-term story arc, it also added layers of nuance and exploration of mental health that another AEW wrestler would later display. So he starts talking about Hangman Page feeling weak and Hangman Page feeling like a loser. Meanwhile, the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega are also suffering losses, and they're dealing with it differently. So then he says, viewers could see all four deal differently with their mental health and how Hangman suffered worse. So he's basically showing that everybody from the beginning, from the Elite, they all suffered losses to a degree, and they all dealt with it differently. Except Hangman, he fell into this den of despair. Comments on being a young boy, the subtlety storyline of the rest of the Elite drinking milk and Hangman drinking more and more booze. The smashed mirror was all cinematic foreboding. Things were untreated, getting worse rather than getting better. Hangman was manipulated by FTR. Hangman's hero journey was about overcoming himself as much as his opponents. He gained friends with the Dark Order, overcame the manipulation of Matt Hardy, dealt with a loss to Brian Cage before becoming world champion. The victory was mental as much as physical. Okay, I can see that. He says, well, he continues. The Hangman Page character, once he won the AEW World Championship, seemed to lose his anxiety. If it was there, it was not signposted as it was before. If the idea was Hangman was overcompensating for that anxiety with confidence or something else, it was played too subtly. Then he says, most notably his feud with Jon Moxley, where Moxley knocked out Hangman when challenging for the world title in Ohio. In their build-up to the Texas Death Match, the stoic Moxley tried to use what he saw as weakness against Hangman. Spoke of how he had no time for the luxuries of anxiety or fear, the old school mentality that just don't think about these things. As a man, you just deal with this stuff. Let it drip off you like sweat. Hangman highlighted how he had nothing left to lose. But to counter Moxley's take, the character talked about mental suffering on an equal level. This is where Hangman starts talking about, and he's quoting Hangman here. I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I can't sleep at night, I'm anxious, I'm depressed, the medicine is not working, and I am still here because I am a man. He goes on to extrapolate from this. It legitimized that sense of suffering as being equal to physical pain and more. Highlights that being a man can involve suffering. It involves emotions and feelings that usually we are told to deny. The medicine doesn't cure it, but being a man is about persistence. It's about getting up when you are knocked out. Literally, in Paige's case, it's about effort and trying despite there isn't an easy answer or cure. It's acknowledging that living through suffering is strength. Yes, living through suffering is strength. Yes, that's true. He hit the nail right on the head. Everybody suffers to some degree. Everybody's life is hard. You're not a special little snowflake just because you had a tough time in school. Just because you had a tough time playing sports and guys bullied you, guess what? Pretty much everybody gets bullied at some point. Yes, being a man is about persisting because nobody's going to put you in a hug box and take care of you. You have to take care of yourself. So his discussion about Hangman Page having mental health at the forefront, it goes to show that not only is this guy very young, apparently, with no male role models, apparently he's just not paying attention to wrestling. There's a lot of storylines in which the wrestler struggles emotionally. Now, he's not going to come out on television and say that he's suffering from some kind of crippling depression. But if they're doing the storyline properly, you can see the concern, the anxiety in the character and how they move and how they work. And sometimes even in the promos that they put together, the pressure that a guy is under. You can see those things without it being said. And this stuff is kind of like run of the mill in wrestling. Not guys standing in the ring talking about, oh, I'm anxious, man. I've been feeling depressed lately. Maybe not. But you can see how dour some guys get when they lose. Or when they're on a losing streak. Or when they're on the downslope. Or when things ain't going their way. And they got to bounce back. They got to dig deep. That's what wrestling is about. That's what the stories of men who win and lose. That's what these things are about. So his next subject is Eddie Kingston. Whoa. Eddie Kingston, as a man, writes this guy, not just a wrestler, depending on who you ask, is either this century's people's champion or a slob. When Kingston cuts a promo, it cuts differently. Kingston delivered a monologue on a cookie and yet made that link to universal fears of body image and having enough money. For years, fans listened to Kingston's character speak from the heart about what goes on in his mind, the frustrations with anger and bad feelings. It felt real. Men suffer in silence. Suicide is the biggest killer of men under 50. Part of the problem killing us is not feeling able to talk about it. Eddie, by doing this so openly, is inspirational. Okay, let's talk about this. Body image. This comes straight out of feminism. This idea that men have issues with their body image. I don't remember ever hearing about this as a kid. I almost never heard about males having body image issues. Never. There were some guys who were more into like bodybuilding than others, but all this body shaming language, this stuff comes straight out of modern feminism. It's not modern masculinity. It's modern feminism. All right. Again, people get picked on for pretty much everything. Being chubby and being fat is just one of those things that people get picked on for. But it's not just the fact that Eddie Kingston is fat. It's also that Eddie Kingston doesn't seem to put forth any effort in looking and behaving like an athlete. That's one of the major issues. Like, there's always been fat wrestlers. Eddie Kingston is like the first fat wrestler. Bam Bam Bigelow was fat. Nobody talked about him being fat. Nobody cared. Yokozuna was fat. Earthquake was fat. Dusty Rhodes was fat. There's always been fat wrestlers. Nobody cared about these guys being fat. It was all about their athletic ability. When you see a guy like Eddie Kingston and he's in the ring, it's not just that he's fat. It's that he's fat and unathletic and seemingly is not in any way working towards improving that. You know, like Dusty was never going to turn into Hulk Hogan. He was never going to turn into the Ultimate Warrior. He accepted who he was, but you could at least look at him and tell that he was trying. He was somewhat athletic. You know, Bam Bam Bigelow would do a cartwheel and a moonsault. Vader would do a moonsault. Every time you hear about Yokozuna, it's all about how a guy that size could be that agile and actually be that safe in dropping the big leg on you. He's got 600 pounds or whatever. You know, there's also talk about Mabel, who was, 500 pounds and not quite as athletic and not quite as safe. There's a reason why people call Eddie Kingston a slob, and he never said the same things about Umaga. There's tons of fat wrestlers. Eddie Kingston did not create the fat wrestler. He created the guy who has all the ability in the world to change how people view him, and he chooses not to. He chooses to be substandard. He chooses to not try. And that is the reason why people make fun of him. Now, you want to say, like, hey, this is a great thing, and he's concerned about his body image. He likes cookies and cakes. Okay. But other fat wrestlers, sometimes it's genetic, sometimes it's a lack of control. I mean, it is what it is. But it's within you to control that. And if people see that you can continue to perform at a high level, despite the fact that you have fat issues, it's okay. People will get over it. Again, Kevin Owens, he's fat. He made it in WrestleMania. He was a world champion in WWE. It happened. And this happened during Eddie Kingston's run in AEW. It happens. Now, I do agree with his commentary about men suffering in silence and suicide being a pretty high cause of death among men. This is true. A lot of suicide, however, is not tied to body image. It's tied to things like divorce, which is, significantly different than body image and mental health struggles. Being absolutely, completely financially destroyed, and that destruction going on in perpetuity for like 20 years, especially if you have children, that can be pretty emotionally damaging. Having your entire family ripped away from you, that can be pretty tough. I had my mom's friend. She had a daughter. The daughter was married to a guy. She threatened to leave him. The guy used to invest in rental properties. He went to one of his rental properties and he just sat down with a couple bottles of alcohol and drank himself to death. They found him, 4 or 5 days later, he was already dead. And there was nothing else in the house except bottles of alcohol in his body. And that was it. Because he thought he was going to lose all 3 of his children and his wife and a lot of his properties that he had already invested in was going to get taken away from him in the divorce. He drank himself to death. That has fuck all to do with anything in terms of this kind of stuff. If he was to say, hey, I'm going to get financially destroyed in a divorce, how many of these male feminists would stand up and say that was wrong? That shouldn't happen. Almost none of them. So don't give me this bullshit about you caring about men committing suicide. Because then you want to start digging into the reason why a lot of these guys commit suicide. Okay? Then we could talk about it. If I thought that these people were serious about male suicide, we could sit down and have a conversation about it. But it's just used because it's toxic masculinity. He should have went to therapy. Therapy is not going to bring back everything that he worked for. That's not going to bring back his wife and his children. No, killing himself wasn't going to fix the problem. But therapy wasn't either. It was only going to teach him how to cope with this really terrible situation that he found himself in that he didn't want to be in. And he didn't want to cope with it. There's nothing that a therapist can do. There's no pill that they're going to be able to prescribe you that's not going to do anything except numb the pain that you're already going through. Trust me, I work with suicidal male patients. Quite a few of them. They sit around, they take pills, And they still cry over the girlfriend or the wife that left them. They still cry over the kids they don't have. And they still think about killing themselves. They just won't admit it because they want to get out of the hospital. So these things are real. Men do suffer in silence from some very real issues. Body image, not likely to be one of them. Having your life destroyed, kind of is. Ed Piskor, the cartoonist from Cartoonist Kayfabe, who killed himself recently because he was accused of all kind of sexual indiscretions with underage people, wrote an entire screed about killing himself because mentally he couldn't handle the pressure of everybody being against him, including some of his friends, because it's an entire society, a culture that was created that said he must be excommunicated without being arrested, without being put on trial, and without really an opportunity for him to defend himself. He lost $75,000 in business in one whop. And that guy said, my career is over. The thing that I lived for, which was comic books, I lived for that. It's gone. And I can never get it back. There's nothing anybody can say or do that's going to make me in demand as an artist again. Nobody's going to hire me anymore. I mean, he could still be alive, but what is he going to do for a living? The only thing he's ever done is be a comic book artist. Now he can't do that anymore. When you create an environment where a guy can't survive and there's nothing but punishment, a boot on his neck forever, then yeah, I would imagine suicidal ideation would skyrocket. And there would probably be a lot more suicides in jails if the guards or whatever wouldn't stop it and wouldn't catch these guys and wouldn't give them the opportunity to do it. Especially some of these guys who be in prison for 30 or 40 years or something like that. Who the hell wants to live in a cage for 40 years? A lot of these guys would probably try to commit suicide. But that's all environmental. It's a sense of hopelessness that is created in the man through him not being able to find any way out of these situations. And you could talk about therapy all day, but you're not going to therapy yourself off death row. You're not going to therapy yourself out of, skull crushing alimony and child support for multiple children. You're just not going to therapy your way out of that. You could therapy your way out of losing your mom, losing your brother, some really terrible shit, alcoholism and different things like that. But something that is just going to be a constant reminder, not everybody's built for it. And yeah, men should talk about it more. But when they do, and they talk about where this stuff comes from, cancel culture, brutal family courts, dealings with women where the government is almost 80%, 90% on the side of the women, well, you get called an incel. So how seriously do you really take this subject? So I went way into a different rant. My bad. He starts talking about the Blackpool Combat Club next. And the Blackpool Combat Club, he says, quote, "The Blackpool Combat Club is a strange faction that deserves an entire full analysis. They exist individually as some of the greatest wrestlers on the planet. Collectively, their characters seem to have one motivation: to be hard men. Whether intentional or not, their stoic, always ready to fight presentation has made them gatekeepers of wrestling tradition. Hard men who care only about inflicting violence. Together, they are so hyper-masculine that it's almost parody at times, but it's traditional masculine ideas. The reason I say gatekeepers is when you look at the modern male figures I mentioned, all of them have beaten BCC members in their arcs. Last year, the Elite beat the BCC in a traditional modern wrestling versus traditionalism." Then he starts talking about Orange Cassidy and Moxley losing to guys like Hangman Page and everybody, Danielson and all this stuff, right? Then he continues by saying, "And yet as individuals, the characters and men behind the gimmicks are diverse in their masculinity. Moxley has openly talked about battling addiction. From defeat, Moxley just gets back up again and fights on and hits harder. Danielson is another advocate for mental health who talks openly about his issues. The American Dragon has always been at ease with being different and not a stereotype." Okay, where does any of this mean that men have not had the ability to express that they have flaws like addiction or flaws like mental health struggles and not bounce back from them? I mean, whenever you hear about a man's story, usually you hear what struggles he had to go through in order to achieve that level of success. So if you ever, read a book about, we don't read books about great men anymore. We don't write stories about great men anymore. We spend most of our time destroying statues rather than building them, destroying heroes rather than building them. I talked before, I don't know, so some people might be listening to my voice for the first time. I talked about Christopher Columbus, and that think about the amount of courage it took for nobody to know where the fuck they were going. And they got on a boat, literally a vessel where once you get out in the middle of the ocean, there's nowhere for you to go. And it takes a great deal of courage to even get on the boat, let alone to end up in a strange land where you look different from everybody else, you talk different from everybody else, and you're seeing some of the craziest stuff you've ever seen. And you got to write down and tell other people, like, man, look at this shit I seen on the other side of this large body of water. We spend so much time now destroying people like Christopher Columbus. And look, you can do whatever you want. I'm just saying, think about that perspective. We don't talk about great adventurers anymore. All of our heroes are activists now. Everybody's some flavor of Martin Luther King. People who actually did something that was potentially dangerous and may have even been stupid in their time. Like, hey, you about to get on this wooden ship and go I can't even see what's over there. And you're just going to get on this boat and go over there. Yes. Me and 40 other guys. We about to get on this boat and just sail. And we'll see what happens when we get there. Suicide. If you fall off the face of the planet, nobody will know. Okay, so if we never see you again, then we can safely assume that there is nothing else over there. Otherwise, you'd come back. Now we get into, some more weirdness from this guy. Oh my God. He says, all in at Wembley Stadium last year. It was an event that for me felt like a religious experience. I was overwhelmed by being part of this community, this union where my voice chanted, swore, and sang with everyone else's until it was hoarse. It brought catharsis and spiritualism, but as a man, the main event in particular left me with a transcendent thought. Every man in the crowd was emotional because the match was more about friendship surviving than the fate of the world championship. What? This match was more about a friendship surviving than the fate of the world championship? What? This match was expressly about the world championship. The idea is, yes, there was a question of who would betray who, but ultimately, the only thing that really mattered is who was going to be the world champion. I don't know what the hell's going on in England. I can't tell you what everybody was thinking. But I'm sitting here thinking, okay, who's going to be the world champion? Who's going to stab who in the back? Because we all knew that somebody's going to stab somebody in the back. I was not praying for their friendship. I can tell you that much. I was not concerned about whether they could be friends after this. But whatever. He's going to run down this feud a little bit. The feud started like many real male friendships. It started with banter and insults aimed at each other, being aimed at someone else. This follows the locker room spirit of not only wrestling, but traditional masculinity. Both wrestlers started out with agendas, but through a series of silly vignettes, they noticed they were not that different thanks to male bonding activities, video games, drinking at the bar, eating spicy hot food and steak, and drinking beer. Male stuff. Among the comedy, there were story beats MJF, learning to like and trust people, Adam Cole learning to tolerate and mature. Friendships grew based on learning to understand each other. Okay. How is this subverting traditional masculinity? Because friendships have always been about trusting and understanding each other. Male friendships have always been about, common hobbies, common goals, etc. Those are just traditional relationships, brother. I think you might be a little egg-headed on this one. Your head might be getting a little big on this one. So let's move on. We're going to continue with the MJF theme. He says, Tommy Dreamer at one point said MJF could not have had it in the old school WWE. Why? Because he talks about mental health issues. Quote, they would have eaten him up in the locker room for that. This says that a lot of the old school wrestling mentalities towards masculinity and what men should be. Many, including the wrestlers themselves, might argue men should remain as they are in the past. The logic issue here is that men were just as flawed then. The reality is grimmer. When you look at the death rates of wrestlers and listen to some old school stories of male behavior, violent, physically abusive hazing, the treatment of women like objects, the abuse of their bodies with drugs and steroids. Men might have been physically strong, but not addressing weaknesses killed or hurt many of them. Okay, let's take a pause here. Not addressing what does, now hazing can be psychologically destructive. Part of the hazing process is weeding out the weak. I mean, if you've ever been in the military or in a fraternity or even sometimes in an office space or on a team of some kind, your mental toughness does matter, because again, we just talked about trust. If you cannot be trusted in a high pressure, tough situation, why would somebody want you around? If you fold like a lawn chair at the first sign of pressure, why do I want you on my team? Why do I want you in my club? Why do I want to play with you? Why do I care about you? You're a liability. You're not an asset. Everybody wants to be an asset. Everybody wants to be a strong link on the team, or if you're not the strongest link, at least you're a respectable link on the team. There's nothing wrong with that. Also, a lot of these guys were forced to face their mental health struggles, especially if they had addiction issues, because they ended up either in jail or in a hospital or something like that, where they were diagnosed with problems and they didn't deal with it because therapy and medication can only do so much. Part of it is having insight, and that is agreeing that something is wrong and it needs to be fixed. Most people have no insight into their own need for something like treatment. This is not a male thing. It's just a thing in general. People don't want to be the person who has a mental health issue. They don't want to be a person who is sad and depressed all the time, or, somebody who is bipolar, or somebody who has an addiction. They think they have it under control. This is most people. This is not just a masculine thing. So let's finish this up. MJF might be an old school heel, but he's got modern male perspective. In promos, Friedman has wrenched hearts openly talking about bullying and prejudice, speaking about his experiences with learning disabilities like ADD, things I and other neurodivergent can relate to. Oh, brother. I wish he wouldn't put himself in the middle of these stories so much. He makes it way too easy. Neurodivergent, British, probably fatherless. He's just everything wrong with masculinity is coming out of this guy here. But let's talk about this MJF thing, because I do think what's missed on a lot of people is that MJF was trying to be manipulative with a lot of this stuff. The Jew boy stuff and, being dumped by his girlfriend. A lot of this stuff was being used to justify his bad behavior. The point of it was to position himself as a victim of society. And therefore, when he lashes out, it's just the victim is giving you back what he's always gotten. He's always been bullied. He's always been picked on. So he's going to bully and pick on others. It is justification. It is not some therapy session that was meant for you to feel sympathy for him. He was manipulating you, which is what a lot of people do. Women do this all the time. And I hate to put them that way because male feminists do this too now. They'll put themselves in a position of weakness so that you will come save them, and then they'll manipulate you. They do it all the time, And this is something typical you'll see with heels. They'll beg off. They'll put themselves in a position of weakness. Eddie Guerrero was used to do this beautiful thing where he would bend down and bow to his opponent, kiss their boots and all this kind of stuff. And then as soon as they think, oh yeah, I got him, he'll hit him with a low blow or try to roll him up or something. It's all about taking advantage of you, taking advantage of your good nature, your empathy. Because everybody has it. Everybody empathizes with people. Or it's not like a gender specific thing, empathy or sympathy or whatever. But some people will play these cards in an attempt to snake you. And that's what MJF's gimmick was. Is that he would go out there and he would ramble on about being bullied, being picked on, and then he'll cut a promo 2 weeks later about how he was the most popular guy in school with the fastest car, and he was the jock who played, high school quarterback, and he was getting domed, while he was driving alongside the road and all this kind of stuff. Because it was the whole point of it was to manipulate you in that moment, for you to not boo him. All right, for you to accept him or to excuse his behavior. And that was what made the character interesting, because he would give you those layers. He would give you 500 different origin stories. And all of it was just an excuse to cover up his bad behavior. But let's get back into this thing. AEW male wrestlers talk openly about their mental health struggles. Dax Harwood advocates for therapy during the height of FTR's being multi-promotional champions. Adam Cole showed vulnerability when he returned, talking openly and honestly about his anxieties and fears that caused a life-changing concussion. The Butcher wrote on Instagram about struggling with depression. Mike Bennett posts inspirational videos on social media about struggling with addiction and when men do not feel worthy. Without open dialogue about the struggles men and all human beings face, nothing changes. Men will still kill themselves out of shame and feeling inferior because they do not feel like a man. I'm interested in this whole suicide thing because male suicide is definitely being manipulated and in a way to push men towards feminism. Toxic masculinity is going to make you kill yourself. It's like, no, I can't think of any situation in which, what they view as toxic masculinity, by the way, is wanting to have control over over your life, over your sphere of influence, patriarchy, which is basically being the man of the house, all these things. You're not going to kill yourself over that stuff. Usually people who kill themselves have lost control. They don't have it, and they don't know how to regain what they've lost, or something that they've lost they can never regain, like the death of a family member, the death of a friend, death of a wife or a child or something like that. Those things are not going to be fixed. People have to learn how to cope with that. And sometimes people don't go to therapy and go get checked out, and they end up killing themselves. But a lot of that comes from what we call a lack of insight. It is not because they're toxically masculine. It's because most people deny that there's anything wrong with them. Period. They may say, of course I'm, upset. My wife died. Of course I'm upset. They don't mean that I need to be in the hospital. They don't mean I need a therapist, because it bothers him more than he thinks it does. But he may not have noticed the changes in his own behavior. This is not a toxically masculine situation. It has nothing to do with that. It's just human beings don't notice sometimes their own maladaptive behaviors. When somebody might not notice how their personality has shifted after their parents died, or how their personality may have shifted after the death of somebody really close to them, or how their personality may have changed after they lost their job, or how their personality may have changed after they lost that house that they've been working on for 15 years or whatever. Sometimes people don't even notice that. Sometimes people don't even notice how their sexual proclivities have changed or different things of that nature over time. These are called maladaptive behaviors because they actually actively harm your life, but you're not paying attention to it because you lack insight. So when you lack insight even if something literally is wrong, you will deny it. And this, again, is across, the individual spectrum, whether you're a male or female. Most people do not see how they are doing things that are destroying their own life. And sometimes these things do lead to suicide, but it has nothing to do with toxic masculinity. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with individuals not having insight into their need for treatment and not understanding how a big inciting incident or a bundle of smaller incidents have led them down a bad path. For a lot of people with suicidal ideations, however, it's usually one huge inciting incident. They were molested, they got divorced, somebody died, they were physically injured in some way and deformed. Like a lot of people have TBI, get TBI means traumatic brain injury, and they'll get suicidal from that because they can't think like they used to. They can't write like they used to. They can't communicate like they used to. Their sexual functions may have changed from an accident or something like that, and they don't want to live anymore. There's nothing you can do about that kind of stuff. All right. You just have to teach people how to live with it forever, and hopefully the medications will help them. But it's not because they're toxically masculine. All right. That's just horseshit that's been funneled out of, women's studies. Let's continue this. Now he's going to talk about some of the people who want the real man stereotype to continue. He says, ABC News did a piece pointing out how AEW addresses masculine stereotypes and expectations. There have been and will be critics. Many of them will keep targeting AEW's portrayal of men. The ones most intrinsically attack AEW's portrayal of masculinity include old school minded folks set on gatekeeping what they see as vital. Jim Cornette has referred to AEW as all petite wrestling. The implication is that the men are too small to be real wrestlers. Various fans and even wrestlers have body shamed other male wrestlers from Eddie Kingston to Adam Cole. This projects their prejudices and expectations onto others. There are also those uncomfortable with discussing a concept that seems so defined as being a real man. Let's pause right here because he has a lot to say on this subject. Part of the all petite wrestling is because these guys are very small. It's also because there should be in any athletic endeavor the desire to actually work out and, again, look like an athlete. And if you're not going to do that, then what are we doing here? How are you just going to roll off your couch and get in the ring? Is that what it is? You're not going to put forth any effort? And how dare anybody ask you to put forth any effort? That's ridiculous. Now, body shaming Eddie Kingston and Adam Cole, I am guilty. Guilty as charged. I project my prejudices and expectations onto them. Guilty as charged. And everybody should. You should have higher expectations. There's nothing wrong with higher expectations. Higher expectations, they never hurt anybody. And look, even if you fall short of them, most people would give you credit for trying. People really don't actually go after you unless you show zero effort in trying to change what they see as a flaw in your behavior or a flaw in your presentation. Otherwise, they don't really go after you like that. Let's get back to the article. They will refuse to acknowledge anything beyond its parameters, the parameters of being a real man. The issue is those parameters trap them and other men into a narrow and impossible to achieve set of standards. Some of this it is toxic masculinity. Oh my God. It's an impossible set of standards. Nobody said that Adam Cole has looked like the Ultimate Warrior. Most people compare how Adam Cole looked in NXT to how he looked in AEW. Is that an impossible standard? It's the same person separated by 3 years or so. It's not an impossible standard. Okay, nobody's saying like, this guy, he's no Lex Luger. Some people might say that, but most people are not expecting Adam Cole to be Lex Luger. Most people don't expect Eddie Kingston to be Hulk Hogan. Most people just look at it and say, man, would it be nice if this guy hit the gym and got a tan? Looked presentable on television? What a ridiculous standard. Let's get back into this thing. The reality is wrestlers of different shapes and sizes have proven themselves to connect with audiences and be headliners. Of course, he used Dusty Rhodes. He starts talking about, he says, quote, the concept that every man or wrestler needs to fit neatly into a specific mold to be a good pro wrestler has been proven false by wrestling history. And nobody is saying that everybody has to be the same. That's not what everybody is saying. Nobody is saying that. There's literally a mold for everybody. You know, there's big guys, smaller guys, white guys, black guys, gay guys, you know, guys who like to play that middle part, the Gold Dust and the Adrian Adonis and, you know, those kinds of guys. There's a lane for everybody. And wrestling has been wide open when it comes to that stuff. The idea that you're trying to push that wrestling is somehow toxically masculine is pretty ridiculous, considering some of the biggest stars in wrestling have been effeminate in some way, whether they're dandies who color their hair or they take on some kind of effete nom de plume like the Human Orchid, which is what Gorgeous George did. He called himself the Human Orchid, which, you know, likened himself to a flower, which flowers are seen as feminine. And he was seen as effete at the time, but he ended up being a huge box office draw because people liked the character, and he was no way a guy who was into that sort of thing. It was just a gimmick that he created. And this was in the 1940s, perhaps. So this guy's way behind on this. Yes, there's a lot of, you know, tough, hard-nosed, grappling type of guys, you know, the Funks and all that kind of stuff would come later. And everybody had a lane. Everybody had their own piece of this. So my point is, it's not literally as narrow as he's trying to make it sound. There's plenty of room for guys who are not traditionally bodybuilders or even tall. You know, through the magic of lifts, wrestlers can appear taller than they really were. Sometimes a smaller guy will have a huge personality, like a Macho Man Randy Savage or something like that. So the idea that this is some kind of small, narrow space that is being forced upon everybody is, in my view, is false. But I don't know. I know a little bit more about wrestling than this guy probably does. So I don't know. He continues, and this is his final stretch. AEW is not perfect. Well, that's obvious. He says, however, AEW has at least allowed modern masculinity to have a prominent place on their shows. AEW allowed men who traditionally would be seen as weak or mocked for showing feelings appear as men fans can get behind. Pro wrestlers and men are not all to always be invincible, impenetrable, and invulnerable, and men can communicate and deal with their weaknesses and issues with other men. I don't even understand what that means. Yeah. What do you mean that they don't have to be? So again, being invincible doesn't even really draw that much money in wrestling. What draws a lot of money in wrestling is men being vulnerable. When the Junkyard Dog gets blinded, he can't see his daughter. I forget how many, like 20,000 people showed up to the Superdome in Louisiana to see him fight Michael Hayes, who blinded him. That's a vulnerability. That's video packages of him, how he can't see his child. He's upset. This was in 1980, 1981 or something like that. You know, when you see Ricky Morton getting his face grinded into the locker room floor, and every match he's getting the shit kicked out of him. And, you know, you got grown men and grown women and teenage girls crying, oh my God, Ricky Morton, I loved him so much. When Bruno gets his neck broken. And you've got people far and wide sending tons of letters, get well cards to Bruno Sammartino. The men being vulnerable, the Superman who is then made vulnerable, is a huge draw. A smaller guy who is made vulnerable can still be a huge draw because he gets so much sympathy. Sympathy selling is literally, it's like the platinum card of pro wrestling. There is no upper limit to how much sympathy you can get and how much money you can make by being a sympathetic babyface. Being invincible, you can make some money. You know, Ultimate Warrior, the Road Warriors, it can happen. But you make more money when you can be sympathetic. that requires having a little bit more knowledge about this subject. He continues. Compared to WWE, who builds superstars who are presented as strong, superhuman, when WWE or a wrestler talks about an injury, the focus is on how superhumanly fast they have or will recover, or expressing disappointment that they have let the fans down. It's primarily surface and gloss. Modern masculinity is the exception, not the rule. Yes, because nobody wants to hear that, I tore my leg, I'm going to be gone forever. Woe is me. It's like, no, sorry, I got to miss this big match, guys. Again, sympathy. And then once you get that sympathy, then you tell the people, but I'm coming back. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to get this thing. I'm going to get this cast off my arm as quickly as possible. Because now they believe in you that this was a minor setback. You'll be okay. They just did this with CM Punk in WWE. He tore his, tricep or whatever. I don't know what it was. I don't remember. And he came out there, cut the promo. He had the sad eyes. But, he promised that he was going to make a big comeback. He let the fans down. He's going to miss WrestleMania. This was supposed to be his main event. Everybody was expecting that. And he wasn't going to get it. And he played into that sympathy. And then the heel, Drew McIntyre, comes out, plays into that sympathy by utilizing it to make this situation bigger. They found a weakness in CM Punk, and then they exploited it. Because that's what weaknesses are there for. Weaknesses are there to be exploited, not to be championed. All right? If weaknesses were a good thing, a turtle will walk upside down. That's not how nature works. The turtle walks the way that it does with its belly to the ground because it's protecting its weaknesses. You protect your weaknesses. And then in the story, your weaknesses are exposed and then exploited. That's how stories work. That's just how stories work. I'm sorry to be the guy that has to tell you that. Here we go. WWE is still setting old school traditions and values. The company was taken to a global success by a man with very toxic masculine traits. A man who cannot stand anything beyond his control, even a sneeze. Now the company's creative is run by a man who is a wrestler whose character seems paranoid of being presented as vulnerable and weak. It's another reason why having an alternative in wrestling is a good thing. Having multiple ways of presenting wrestling and telling stories about men is a good thing. AEW challenging men to think about masculinity is a good thing. Okie dokie. That's the end of his article about modern masculinity, which is basically, as we know, male feminism. You're supposed to walk around and parade your weaknesses in front of everybody. They want you to be vulnerable. They demand that you be vulnerable. But it's very interesting here that at the very end, he positions WWE as being this, masculine promotion that is focused on traditional views of what a man is. And the top guy, the current world champion, the guy who just won the title in the main event of WrestleMania 40, has been lambasted in the media, specifically from guys like Vince Russo, for crying too much. That's the interesting thing. That's the thing that made me laugh so hard about this, is how many articles or tweets I've seen of people being angry that Cody cries. Like, think about that. This guy is trying to live his daddy's dream, and he goes out there and it's very emotional for him. And he's made fun of for crying all the time. Ric Flair is made fun of for crying literally all the time. So I thought that was very interesting that he wrote at the very end that WWE is all about this traditional masculinity when they tried the tears route a couple of times. They had Roman cry after he got the Money in the Bank. Sheamus cashed in the Money in the Bank on him 2016. Roman was in the green covered in confetti crying. Cody cried. He cries a lot. He cries often, which created the entire term Cody Crybaby, is because Cody cries a lot. And crying is one of the numero uno things that you're not allowed to do as a babyface pro wrestler, is sit around crying all day. But it works. Shawn Michaels cried. When he lost his smile, he cried. And it worked. It got tremendous amount of sympathy. Part of the reason why Cody gets so much sympathy right now is because he cries openly in public. And it seems like now a lot of it is him trying to cry on demand, but that's the general idea, is he is so emotionally invested into the story that he becomes overwhelmed and he cries. And he doesn't try to cover it up because he knows that tears can equal green, just like red can equal green. And you can always do it too much. You can always go too far. He's getting a little My Hero Academia with the tears, but that's the direction WWE is going in. And it's not, the hard man, the hard guy. It's Cody is showing that there are subjects that make him emotional. There are topics where he has a difficulty talking about it, where he gets choked up. And then he allows other people to play into it, talking about his parents, talking about, his failures, showing that vulnerability. And that's where he got to the main event of WrestleMania. And this, in more modern WWE, they are starting to do a lot more of that, showing insecurities with Sami Zayn, for instance. His whole WrestleMania thing, where he was afraid of letting everybody down. He didn't want to go out there and embarrass himself in front of Gunther and in front of the world and in front of his wife and his child again. That was one of the motivations for Chad Gable. He didn't want to embarrass himself in front of his family. There was a lot of stories like that nowadays, but those stories have always been there. So he's trying to give AEW credit now, maybe specifically talking about depression and anxieties and different mental illnesses like that. Yes, okay, we can say that AEW maybe popularized that, but it's always been there. There's always been wrestlers who have talked about their various struggles and how they overcome them, because that's part of what makes a character human. And characters have become more human over time. Not everybody's going to be the Ultimate Warrior. Not everybody's going to be Hulk Hogan or Hawk and Animal. Sometimes people are going to be Shawn Michaels. They're going to be Bret Hart. They're going to be Eddie Guerrero or Chris Benoit or Kurt Angle or, Chris Jericho or somebody like that. The smaller guy who tries to play upon the emotional range because they know that's what gets people over. That's been a staple in pro wrestling forever. It's not nothing that AEW created, but that's just me talking out my ass. But what do you guys think? Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Like, share, subscribe. Thank you for your time. I will talk to you guys later, man. Peace out. And sometimes it is because, the guy won't talk. It's not saying that, it never happens. What I'm saying is the higher the likelihood of it is very rare. The reason why guys get painkillers isn't because they don't talk about their pain. It's because they're in pain and they went to a doctor and the doctor gave them a prescription. So then they went and got painkillers with that prescription. So you can't say, oh, they don't talk about their feelings and their failures and all this kind of stuff. Most of the time, people don't understand or not in touch with their own feelings. People don't navel gaze. They don't sit around thinking about their own feelings all day. But we live in a different society than we used to. The focus on mental health is much more prominent than it used to be. for better or worse. We're finding out that everybody's neurotic. Everybody's, on some kind of pill for some reason. They're not sleeping appropriately. They're stressed out. But then again, that's life. It's everybody's life. Everybody is stressed out. Everybody is going through drama of some description. I think it's unfair to turn everything into a therapy session. I don't think a wrestling show should be a therapy session.